Okay, so welcome everyone. What I will do today is I will give an introduction to how the course is structured. I will give introduction to how like I'm going to approach the writings of Freud, what things we will focus on, and what will be the readings, how you should be able to follow yourself with the course, and what you could do more from it. Okay, so the aim and structure of the course is pretty straightforward. The aim is to trace the lineage of Freud's writings over the course of his life. So we will look at the history of how his writings change and how it's connected to his life. And secondly, we will look at significant moments where he made contributions and changes to his writings. So there are moments in Freud where he is very contradictory and he is in dilemma of what theoretical framework to choose. And we will look at those moments because those are the significant moments from which different schools of psychoanalysis arose. So that will be a literary look at the work. And then we will look at how broad, complicated, and deep Freud's corpus is, and how it led to the birth of psychoanalysis. So the third one is basically an introduction to people who did not have a background in psychoanalysis or have never read anything psychoanalytic before. And this will give them a good background and basis for anything in psychoanalysis following Freud. So that's the aim of the course. Those are the three aims. The structure of the course is as chronological as possible. I want it to be rigorously chronological. And so we will start from the Freud's early neurological interventions from mid-19th century, 1850s, 1870s. And we will continue it till his unpublished writings during the late 1930s. And when you connect that to the aim of the course is that we were going through each thing that Freud wrote, each major thing that Freud wrote, and we're connecting that to these three things. How does each paper connect to the significant moments? How does each paper connect to his life and, the complexity and all of that? So we're going to do that chronologically. Each lecture of the course is designed either according to a particular of such periods in Freud's writings, or it would be focusing on a specific set of publications that go together. So what I mean by this is that each lecture will either look at a period in Freud's writing, let's say from 1895 to 1900, or the lecture can be surrounding a set of publications. Let's say from 1901 to 1905, he wrote Interpretation of Dreams, 3 essays, and other few things. And we will look at those set of publications. So lectures are designed like that. Either we're going to look at a specific time period or a specific set of publications. The course, especially in the early part, borrows a fair amount from the broader history of psychiatry and neurobiology. So things that existed before Freud, you can imagine, if anyone is familiar, Kraepelin and other people who were before Freud and what psychiatry looked like before Freud. And this early part of the course is going to borrow a bit from that to give context. So all in all, the structure attempts to put Freud into the historical context of the field and neighborhood fields as much as possible. That's how the structure is. So what will we cover? Well, the goal is to focus at each period in Freud's life, list down what he wrote, what was the history around him, and explain how he continues his development. So the first part of the course will go through pre-psychoanalysis, the period from 1885 to 1894. Then so in pre-psychoanalysis would come his papers on cocaine, it will come his papers on his correspondence with Wilhelm Fleiss, his neuroscientific works, and things that became so to say, redundant after he did his psychoanalytic work, but they are somewhat important for the context. So that's pre-psychoanalysis. Then we will have the beginnings, and the beginnings are from 1895 to 1899. So these are the publications and the climate around which psychoanalysis took its birth. It was the period when Freud was treating the hysterics, when he came back from France, which we will look at in a few minutes. And these set of publications approached how to begin talking about psychoanalysis. He still did not have the foundations. He was trying to stumble upon some ways of treating patients, and those were the beginnings. So in the beginnings, we will look at studies on hysteria, we will look at preliminary communication in hysteria, and we will look at a few other things. If you look at the notes, which I will post later, I'll list down exactly which publications we go through in each of these periods. Then comes the foundations. In the foundations, which is from 1900 to 1905, we're going to look at the texts that set down the foundation stone for the rest of the psychoanalytic movement. So those will be the famous interpretation of dreams, psychopathology of everyday life, jokes and their relation to the unconscious, and the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. These books, which became hinged to Freudian psychoanalysis for the rest of millennia, are in the foundations, and we will look at those set of publications and a few other smaller publications that are not discussed about but give better context. So that's in the foundations. In the clinical cases, we will look at, so this is part of the course which is not entirely chronological, because here we're only looking at a specific type of publications. So what we will do is we will look at the 5 famous cases of Freud and a few other not so famous cases of Freud. But the first 5 famous cases we will look at are the Dora, Ida Brauer case of hysteria. We will look at the obsessional neurotic case of Ratman, Ernst Lanzer. We will look at the case of Justice Schreiber, the Judge Schreiber, and we'll look at Wolfman, Sergei Pankev. So that's where the first part of the course will end. So this period of Freud is just after he sets down the foundation stone and just before he goes back to them and starts making further revisions. So that's, so to say, the first part in a nutshell, is just after he sets down the foundation and just before he goes back to them and starts changing them and applying them in different fields. And that latter part is what will go in part 2 of the course. A bit of word on books and readings. So the course is synthesized from a really broad variety of books and other reasons, and part of the reason is because I'm emphasizing a lot on the history. But most of the books that I will refer to fall into these categories. Either they're Freud's original writings, which is from the standard edition, translated by James Strachey. If you look at the course page of the course, the website, you will look that I have provided links to all of the 23 volumes of the standard edition. So the Freud's original writings are the single most important thing in the course that we will refer to all the time. Then we will refer to Freud's correspondences, Freud's letters to his colleagues, to his friends, to his wife, to give better historical context on what we are reading. They're not going to be immensely important, but they're going to be partially important. Most of the time we're going to look at Freud's letters to flies, because some of the letters to flies became the foundations for later theories of Freud. So they're very important. Also we'll look at Freud's letters to Jung, Otto Rank, and others. So that's the second set of references I will make. The third set of references is very broad. I will refer to works of other psychoanalysts. I will refer to Freudians, the closest colleagues of Freud, like Fenichel, or Otto Rank, Karl Abraham, all those people who developed on top of Freud and had significant works. I will refer to them whenever I can. Then I will have books referring to history of psychiatry or psychology or psychoanalysis. This is where I will be bringing my history partially from. There's history coming from letters, but there's also secondary literature on the history. And I will mention some of the books related to that. Then I will be referring to biographies of Freud. There's a wealth of biographies written of Freud by a lot of people, and those would be also helpful. Lastly, I will be referring to secondary sources which trace certain periods of Freud. So certain books that only talk about the cases or only talk about the hysteria part of Freud, and those are the secondary sources that I will refer to. So these are vaguely the categories from which the books will come from. So what you have to have is the original books of Freud, original papers. If you do not read them, you should have them because they're going to be referred all the time. And that's what the course is based on. And then you should have also something that would help you guide through Freud's books. So there's a reader, which is Reading Freud by the New Library of Psychoanalysis. You should check that out. It's a very well-edited, well-written book, which traces most of the major writings of Freud and guides you through each one of them. And that book is an undercurrent to most of what I will say in the course. Then you should also have a book on the history of psychoanalysis. You can pick something like Ellen Berger's The Discovery of the Unconscious, or you can pick George Macquarie's Revolution in Mind. Both of those books, the first one is very encyclopedic and classic. Macquarie's one is less well known, but it's also very well written. So you should have something like that by your side as well. And lastly, you should have a biography of Freud by your side. You can pick one that fits your needs. The classic one, the sort of canonical reference is Peter Gay's, but there are others that are less well known, such as Joel Whitebook's Freud, an intellectual biography, or the latest contemporary one by Adam Phillips, Becoming Freud. You can pick one of those that feel good to you. So in the notes, you will see a lot of references to a lot of these books. The notes will be updated weekly for every 2 lectures that we complete. And the notes will be updated on the website and will be posted here. After every lecture, I will have a slide that lists some recommended readings from what I just lectured about. There will usually be certain sections or chapters from books. They will not be like big chunks, but there will be little sections that you can just skim through to get a feel of what I talked about. And or for those who are really interested, they can go through that and learn more. So now, as I've done the housekeeping stuff, that's about the course, how we're going to do it. Any questions about the course, about the structure, about how we're doing it, before I move on to the original meat of today's lecture? Any questions about like how we're going to do the course, like any books, references, anything about the course?
Materials, other than the attached lectures on the website, is there anything else to read?
Right, so that's what I said, right? So other than the attached notes, so how it's going to be is when I lecture, I will be referring to certain papers of Freud. I will be referring to other people who talk about those papers of Freud. So I will be making those references. So you are not recommended to go through each of the references, but what you should do, you should have handy the papers of Freud. And so that what you can do is when I mention those papers, you can go through them and look at them to make more sense. So in the website, the Freud books are mentioned. So that's what you should have. Other than that, you can have material on the basis of what you need or what you want.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Yes, you can always ask in the chat. I'm not exactly looking at the chat right now, but I can respond later. Okay, so that's about the books and readings. Now, coming to Freud. So I'm going to, for the rest of the lecture, tell you about the history of Freud. And I will give you the climate into which Freud came about, the climate into which Freud entered. So I will also talk about what was before Freud and, how he was dealing with that. So, in a letter from the 1st February of 1900, Freud writes to his best friend, Wilhelm Fleiss, and he says, I'm actually not at all a man of science, not an observer, not an experimenter, not a thinker. I'm by temperament nothing but a conquistator, an adventurer, if you want to translate it, with all the curiosity, daring, and tenacity characteristic of a man of this sort. This is the Freud whom we want to investigate through his writings. We're not looking at Freud, whether he's scientific or not, whether he's very intellectual or philosophical or not. We're looking at Freud as an adventurer who is venturing into these unknown domains that no one else got into, and what he stumbled during those adventures. That's the kind of feeling you should have when we go through these lectures. So that's the Freud, the conquistator. So how did Freud start to become this conquistator? Well, Freud, just to give a detail, Freud was born on May 6th of 1856 to Jewish parents who were wool merchants in present-day Czechoslovakia, and they were struggling financially. Freud came to Vienna when he was at the age of 4. Freud's early university experience was not the best, partly because he was a Jew, but he learned a lot, as he says, from Ernst Burke's physiology. He trained under him, and he was a big name. He also trained Breuer, another colleague of Freud. Until 1882, he worked there at the university before getting advised by his father that he should leave theoretical domains. He should not get into physiology just for theory, but he should actually work as a clinician, because that's where the money is. So he left the theoretical domains and he entered the general hospital as a clinical assistant. He worked there as a clinical assistant, and he got promoted to be a junior of medicine. And he worked there for some time under the advisory of Theodor Meinert, who was a big name back then in neuropathology. In the spring of 1885, Freud was getting to sense the greatness that Charcot's name was producing from France. He set his mind to study in Paris with him. So Charcot was a big name by then, in 1885 especially, because he was studying the hysterics. He was like almost a celebrity in medicine, in anatomy, in physiology, especially in neurology. He did a lot of areas, but especially in neurology, where he excelled. So through a testimonial of Burke, he was given a traveling bursary for his journey to Paris and study at the famous Salpêtre. Salpêtre was a hospital in France. Now it is under University of Sorbonne, but that's where Freud set out to study. But before we go more into what Freud did there, we're going to look at what France was like before Freud arrived there. So when Freud stopped at Paris in 1885, France was already one of the big centers for cutting-edge research on things related to psychology. By 1885, France had a glamour of like scientists working on things related to psychology. Unlike the Germans, French thinkers during these mid-19th century, the French thinkers were not late to understand the importance of mind in the domain of science. The Germans were, so to say, caught up in the metaphysical, religious ways of talking about the self or the soul, but the French were quick to understand its scientific side. So by the method of psychologie nouvelle, this made France into a hub of studies on somnambulism, automatism, consciousness, multiple selves, possessions, and all these things that somehow were attributed to the soul, to the mind or the self, right? And how this happened was actually just a century after the French Revolution. And the father behind this transition from pulling psychology out of metaphysical and philosophical domains to a scientific endeavor was due to Theodore Ribot. And in his contemporary English psychology, Ribot, for the very first time, brought British ideas to the French soil. And this became a standard reference for psychology in France. Ribot was, so to say, your usual scientist, like what you would now think. He was against metaphysics or religion. But back then it was pretty new. But what Ribot tried to vigorously do was he was criticizing the works of Descartes or Victor Cousin, who spoke of psychology as if it has something to do with the soul. It has something to do with transcendental questions. It has something to do with all these things that cannot be objectively looked at. And Ribot was entirely against them. As Ribot was kind of exploring this, trying to lay down his foundations of how he can do psychology as a science, there were certain critics of Ribot. One of the big names around this time was Auguste Comte. And Comte became very well known for his work on epistemology. Comte tried to say that purely looking at objective experimental knowledge is how you get out of metaphysical domains, is how you get out of theological domains. So he was, so to say, your original positivist, who believed that the perfect state of knowledge would surpass the metaphysical domains. So now you would think that Ribot and Comte are doing the same thing, but actually they are not, because Comte is more concerned about epistemology in general, and science in particular, but he's not so concerned about psychology. Ribot, on the other hand, is very much concerned about psychology. So Comte, even though he was the original positivist, he brought a big problem for Ribot, because psychology was at heart reliant on self-observations. It was trying to explain what I feel, what I think, all my thoughts, my symptoms, and all of those were not really well established on objective grounds. So what this proposed a problem is, how do you talk about psychological things objectively? How do you talk about feelings, thoughts objectively as a science? And Ribot was struggling with this problem, and Comte was totally good with throwing psychology in the domain of literature or arts, or at best he said psychology, you can derive psychology but by only looking at behavior and then looking at the anatomy behind the behavior. So he was very much concerned of things that are empirical and objective. And what Comte concluded was that psychology can never actually become an actual science, because it could never become objective. He says this in his Positive Philosophy. He says, after 2,000 years of psychological pursuit, no one proposition is established to the satisfaction of his followers. They are divided, to this day, into a multitude of schools, still disputing about the very elements of the doctrine. This interior observation gives birth to almost as many theories as there are observers. And that's not how you do science, right? You have to do science by having an agreement on what the observers observe. And if you continually have a sort of contradiction, internal contradiction, then for Comte that is relevant to science. So that's the sort of problem that Comte was proposing. And Ribot, after several of his rigorous studies, what he came to as a solution was heredity. In his 1873 text, Heredity, a Psychological Study of Its Phenomena, Laws, Causes, and Consequences, a very classic textbook, if you will. There he argued that evolution and biological inheritance can account for a good deal of what happens in our minds. So Ribot tried to, for the first time, argue that even though psychological stuff like thoughts, feelings, desires, these symptoms cannot be objectively talked about, but you can talk about biological inheritance objectively. So he tried to connect that. He tried to say that these sort of symptoms, these sort of thoughts that happen due to a hereditary chain, right? So that was Ribot's solution. So what he did was he said the psychological content, which is thoughts, feeling, would be studied by ways of associationism. I will say a bit about associationism because it was actually a school of psychology which was an alternative to the traditional way of speaking of the soul. And what associationism was brought up by John Stuart Mill, Hartley, and a few others. So I think there was also a British thinker who tried to consider thoughts, feelings as complexes, as associations. You associate things repeatedly, and what produces from them is just purely from associations. There is nothing, so to say, biological about it. It's just a form of abstract association. There's more to that. Associationism was a very strong school that everyone was kind of critiquing against by that time. But that's the gist of it. So what Ribot was trying to do is that he will say, okay, psychological content, that can be associationism. Like, we can have thoughts, feelings, we can associate them, and we can have complexes form from them. But psychic faculties, the things that created symptoms, and like feelings that related to symptoms, those would be hereditary theories. Like, sexual desire and psychological stuff related to desire, those would be hereditary theories. So that was Ribot's kind of hybrid theory. He was trying to bring associationism and Darwinism, a form of Darwinism, together, right? And this worked. This worked magically. This became the mainstream in French psychology, as Pierre Janet, who was the successor of Ribot, said decades later. He said Ribot was the reason French psychology achieved such original and rich orientation. This hybrid theory of associationism and hereditary theory became immensely popular, and it made France popular for its contributions to psychology. So that's how Ribot made France popular. So that connects to how I said when Freud was coming to France, France was already the center for cutting-edge research. So that's what Ribot did. But Ribot's contributions were soon to be superseded by another Frenchman. That was Jean-Martin Charcot, whom I mentioned previously. And Charcot was one of the significant figures in the life of Freud, something that Freud always went back to in one way or another. And this is more important than Ribot, even though Ribot was important in France and to some French thinkers like Janet. But for Freud, Ribot did not matter as much as Charcot did. And the reason will be clear in coming lectures. But a bit more about Charcot. So Charcot was very well regarded in his domain of medicine, in his domain of neurology, and so forth. He was a physician. He was not interested in psychology. He was a positivist. He was most of what Ribot did was uninteresting to him. He was a neurologist, as I said, but he believed that mind is simply a phenomenon of the functioning brain. There's nothing more to that. He would refrain the least from going to anything metaphysical, anything that did not just refer to the anatomy or the neurology. That was Charcot. And that, even though like he was so strict about this, that did not affect his fame. He was very well regarded for treating a lot of diseases in neurology. So this was the precursor to a change which came when he was appointed at the hospital of Salpêtre to treat about 5,000 women who were deemed insane, epileptic, demented, and almost incurable. Salpêtre, if you look at historical paintings of Salpêtre, you will realize it was, so to say, a house for all these kind of women who were suffering from these kind of diseases. And Charcot was appointed as a head of that place to treat them. So this story we will continue when we go into hysteria, because this is very much related to hysteria. We're not going to go into details, but the main thing here is that by treating this woman, Charcot had to slowly realize that neurological approaches, neurological domains are not enough. He realized that when he's hypnotizing the hysterics, thoughts somehow affect the neurology. Thoughts somehow affect the behavior. It's like if he says in the hypnotic state that the hysteric would paralyze, then the hysteric actually paralyzed. And the neurology was also correspondingly appropriate. So this thing kind of made Charcot doubt himself on what he has done throughout his whole life on neurology. It was like, it's like being the big name in a whole field and being at loss on how to explain this phenomena. And we will also go later in the very next lecture on how hypnotism affected Freud and what is a bit of history of hypnotism. But for Charcot, hypnotism was just a way of seeing changes in the neurology. What he could not explain was how those changes came about. So what he needed was a psychology, something that Comte had abandoned altogether. And even though Charcot, as I said, was a strict positivist, something Comte would admire, but nonetheless, when he came to this Salpêtre and he tried to treat the hysterics, he realized he's at loss of some framework, and he realized he needs something from the psychological domain. So that's what Charcot believed he needed. But as I said, we will go back to that in the next lecture when we talk about hysteria, because that's where the change happened. But going back to Freud, so this was all happening in France before Freud stepped into Salpêtre. There was Ribot, there was Comte. Ribot giving a solution to Comte. Then comes Charcot, following Comte, but somehow failing to follow Comte. That's all before Freud. But that's the area, that's the climate that Freud stepped into, right? So when Freud came to France, Charcot was on board with Ribot's model already. Charcot had given up on positivism grounds, and he was like, okay, we're going to work on psychological domains, and we're going to understand how is it that these things are happening. So he was following Ribot's model and working on his hypnotic method to understand the mind, more specifically the unconscious, because he realized when he's putting people, the hysterics, into unconscious state in the hypnosis, what happens to them they're not aware of. He can say to them that move a hand, say these sort of things, and they will do all of that, but they were not aware of that. So somehow there was a part of mind which was hidden from them. And again, to reiterate, these are, so to say, the stumblings that people were arriving at when they were finding the unconscious or trying to discover when things cannot be explained. So Freud tried to attend Charcot's lectures diligently. He would attend them on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Mondays were Charcot giving lectures on the latest research that he was doing. Tuesdays were the most interesting. There are publications of the Tuesdays lectures that you can access even now. But the Tuesdays were a theatric kind of demonstration of cases that puzzled Charcot, cases of hysteria that he was not able to understand. And he would bring them to the stage, and he would tell the story of the patient, and he would put them into an hypnotic state, and he would explain to others how, in the hypnotic state, things are not working. And there are several things problematic with that kind of approach. We will talk about that later. But that's what he did on Tuesdays. So Freud attended Charcot on Mondays, Tuesdays, and on Wednesdays for ophthalmology. So Freud was like, for the half of the week, he was with Charcot, and the other half he was writing his own papers on neurology, which we will look next in the next lecture, the specific papers. So Freud worked with Charcot on what Charcot thought was the future. Charcot was now realizing that anatomy, like looking at anatomical lesions in the brain, did not help explain things. And what Charcot was being convinced with was that neurosis was the future. And neurosis for Charcot were the nervous symptoms that did not have anatomical explanations. As I repeat, they're nervous symptoms, nervous conditions, something related to the nervous system, but they're somehow not explanatory enough through anatomy. And these sort of neuroses were what Charcot thought was the future of biology, or the study of the mind. So Freud with Charcot studied male cases of hysteria, something we will also look at. But male cases of hysteria were very rare. According to some old statistics, in 20 female cases of hysteria, you will find one case of male hysteria, which is pretty rare, but it's still nonetheless there compared to the usual understanding that hysteria is always related to the females. So these cases of male hysteria came from trauma, from sexual abuse in the early childhood and other forms of trauma, and Charcot was studying them. And Charcot was taking a lot of insights from them, because hypnotism worked differently in the cases of male hysteria and female hysteria. So that was in France, but in Germany, German neurologists were not really as good on terms with traumatic hysteria. For example, Oppenheim, from Hermann Oppenheim, a German neurologist, believed that traumatic hysteria can be purely explained in terms of anatomy. Freud actually went to Oppenheim, and this is again one point you can realize, that Freud was never in that period committed to anything. Even though he was amazed by what Charcot was doing in his Tuesday lectures, he was still exploring and finding different options on how hysteria can be explained, how trauma can be explained. So he went to Berlin to meet Oppenheim, to see what he thinks. But nevertheless, Freud was actually on the side of Charcot. He believed that neurosis cannot be explained through anatomical lesions, and he believed in Charcot's usage of hypnosis and the altered states. And this is, so to say, the place where we're going to start next time, and we're going to dig much deeper into this, is that when Freud came from France to Vienna, he's bringing Charcot's ideas with him. He, so to say, wants to work on these things that Charcot was magically doing and find his own sort of explanations for this, right? So, like, you can think of Freud being, so to say, mesmerized by Charcot, but not entirely mesmerized, because when Freud was in the, so to say, inner circle of Charcot, which included some of Charcot's closest students like Pierre Janet, there was Tourette, and a few others, Freud realized that those who dogmatically followed Charcot had a good time, and those who were a bit questioning and a bit more curious outside of the domain, um, they were kind of not seen on good terms. And for other reasons as well, Freud could not, so to say, sustain the environment in France. So he did not stay forever in France. He just stayed there for about a couple of months, 6 to 8 months, and then he came back to Vienna. So this kind of like not feeling the best about Charcot, let's say, like seeing that he's seen as some sort of dogmatic figure, even though of course Freud is still admiring Charcot, but still he does not appreciate this kind of dogmatic position. So he came back, and these would be the seed for how Freud created his own way of looking at hysteria, which is going to be radically different from that of Charcot and Pierre Janet. It will, if you look at the papers on hysteria, which we will do that together, but you will see that there is immense influence of Charcot in his writing, but he is not hinging on Charcot. He has his own, approach. So what was it that Freud felt wrong? We will look at this, of course, when we look at the papers themselves. But in short, is the theatrics and the routinized demonstration in Charcot's lectures. It's like what would happen in a typical lecture of Charcot is that Charcot would bring a woman on the stage. She would sit on the chair. She would be hypnotized into the trance state, and she would be given suggestions. And depending upon what sort of symptoms that hysteric has in the state of hypnosis, he could reproduce those symptoms and explain how they work and the relationship, and also explain how certain things he cannot wrap his head around that puzzled him. So these sort of like routinized demonstration looked a bit kind of uncanny to Freud, because he was like saying, well, regardless of what you're explaining, these are not like diagrams on a paper that you can just explain to everyone. These are actual human beings. And even though somehow magically Charcot can always explain the symptoms and put them into the hypnotic state, Freud for some reason realized that there has to be something beyond the hypnotic state. Like hysteria cannot always be explained through this way of hypnosis, and that is also the seeds for Freud's rejection of hypnosis, which we will see later. But this is what was like kind of bugging Freud, is that how is it that Charcot is limiting himself to just hypnosis or this trance state to explain? And because these are human beings, they must have life beyond this, right? Now what about that? So that's what Freud felt a bit wrong about it. But at the same time, as I said, it's difficult because Freud never really completely discounts Charcot. He disagrees with him, but he is amazed by him. So when Freud comes back to Vienna, what is in his mind is essentially he wants to be the Charcot of Vienna. He wants to recreate the approach to treat the hysterics, to understand the mind, to understand the unconscious. And that happened in several ways. He started with hypnosis. Hypnosis did not work. He says in several letters to Fleas that he is far from the ability that Charcot has in hypnotizing patients. For many patients, that Freud just could not put them into the hypnotic state. That was one of the many reasons Freud had abandoned it. But when he came back to Vienna, Freud started translating the works of Charcot, and he was trying to be as acquainted with his inner circle as possible in terms of letters and all. But this was the beginning, what was to become an opposition to Charcot. Not just to Charcot, the students of Charcot as well, like Pierre Janet. And part of what the disagreement and opposition was about is that Freud realized the hysterics have a life beyond the hypnotic state. And what he realized was when you let the hysterics talk, when they talk about their trauma, their experiences, maybe by putting them into a bit more of relaxing state so that they can talk, you realize there's a pattern, there's a structure, there are memories connected to each other, and it's not about just this neurology of hypnosis, right? So that's what Freud had in mind when he came to Vienna, and then we would realize, he meets Brouwer, he puts up the studies on hysteria. We'll see all of that, but that will be until later. So thank you for staying until this lecture. We will meet next time, and we will see the neurological works of Freud. We will see how Freud started his friendship with fleas, what Freud wrote on aphasia, the first book of Freud, and we will look at how he got started into getting away from neurology and more into psychology. So thank you very much. And these are the recommended readings as I promised for today's lecture.